You're listening to A Family History of, the podcast where we explore major moments of Britain and Ireland's past through the eyes of the families who lived them. I'm Jen Baldwin, genealogist and research specialist at Find My Past, and for this three-part story, I'm not just your host, I'm also connected to the story we're telling. Archibald MacKenzie, the man at the heart of this journey, is my fourth great-grandfather. In part one, we walked with Archibald through the quiet lanes of Coolderry as the shadow of the famine began to fall. In part two, we stood in the mud of a riot, a desperate act in dire times, and watched hunger tighten its grip. Now, in part three, the story crosses the sea. From famine-stricken Cork to the iron valleys of Merthyr Tydfil, we follow Archibald into a stark new world, a place where survival means hard labor and echoes of the past still linger. How do families rebuild after catastrophe, and what traces remain in the records they left behind? Welcome to A Family History of the Irish Famine. This is part 3, Escape and Aftermath.
Merthyr Tydfil, South Wales. The year is 1856. Smoke coils above the rooftops, thick and acrid. The ironworks roar like caged beasts, furnaces spitting sparks, molten metal glowing like captured fire. Archibald MacKenzie moves through the yard, cheeks blackened, hair stiff with ash, sweat stinging his eyes despite the chill. His shoulders ache from wheeling iron through the forge on bulky trucks. Around him, men shout over the din, Irish voices mingling with Welsh, clipped by urgency. The air tastes of iron and coal dust. This is not the green hush of Coolderry. It is a world of smoke and steel, where survival is a daily test of strength. Archibald pauses his truck for a moment, muscles trembling, and grips the handle tight. Behind him, the furnaces flare, a reminder that in this valley, fire rules everything.
Okay, so we're picking up our story again. We're starting with the 1861 census for Merthyr Tydfil. We see names packed tight, like the houses that they lived in. Occupations listed almost in a scribble. There are forge laborers, lodgers squeezed into back rooms, and there among this crowded environment is Archibald MacKenzie. Now 40 years old, working as a forge laborer, living on Bethesda Street with his wife Eliza and their children. Some are born in Ireland, others born in Wales. So for me, as both a genealogist and Archibald's descendant, those lines are clearly more than just facts. They tell us Archibald made it across the Irish Sea. He survived the famine. But it also hints at the cost. It's a family that's been uprooted. They're carrying the weight of what they've just experienced into this new world. So to help us understand what life looked like for Irish migrants in this industrial corner of Wales and what those census entries really reveal, I'm joined once again by Irish historian Fiona Fitzsimons, whose expertise is going to help us bring this chapter of the story to life. So welcome back, Fiona, and thank you once again for being here.
Thanks, Jen. It's good to be back again.
So let's start with the big picture. Archibald has already been through a lot to get to this point. He's finally made the journey overseas like so many of his countrymen. In your line of work as an academic and your work with EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum in Dublin, how core is this type of story, this struggle, this immigration to Irish history?
I think Archibald MacKenzie's story, safe to say, it's pretty much emblematic of the Irish immigration experience. We've said already the Irish famine in earlier episodes that it was the worst crisis that ever engulfed Ireland. The population fell by over 3 million in the space of 10 years. About 1 million died, with a margin of error of 250,000. Between 1845 and 1855, another 2 million people emigrated, and that's 1 in 3. So I think it's fairly safe to say it was a seismic shock. Usually changes on that scale take place over generations. In Ireland, it happened in less than 10 years. And one of the long-term effects of the famine was to accelerate emigration. The preferred destination, we again already said, would have been North America because the economy was expanding and there were jobs and there was industry. But not everyone could afford the transatlantic fare, and it was particularly tough for families. Now, Irish emigrants took different strategies. Some of them sent the father and the older sons first, and they might find work and lodging, and they'd create a foothold. And then they would send for the wife and for the younger children when funds allowed. But families with fewer resources, they often went first to Great Britain, and they would have worked there for 10, maybe 15 years to earn the family's passage across the Atlantic. Now, I think Archibald's story fits this second strategy. He managed to keep his family close and with him. And his story, I think, is it's typical rather than exceptional.
So it's really fascinating the way you kind of frame all of this, because it gives us insight into the scale of everything that's happened from kind of a macro level, but also for the individual experience and the individual journey. And your description of the, kind of the two most common ways of going through migration. We're going to delve into that in a little bit deeper later in this episode, but that concept of trying to get everybody across at the same time or in pieces, I think that's a really important bit for genealogists, for family historians to understand that paper trail can come in fragments like that. So for Archibald, for those around him, kind of fresh off the boat, if you will, what this means is that he's trying to carve out a space in a town which looks a lot different to where he had come from, where he considered home, and a community that wasn't necessarily welcoming either.
Yeah, Jen, and that's why I love that we're starting this episode with the 1861 census. There is an entire world contained in that record, and it hints that there's more to this story to uncover that we have yet to find.
The 1861 census is just one moment in time, but to really understand Archibald's work and the environment that they're now in, we need to look kind of beyond those few details at the wider circumstances. He's in Wales, he's in Merthyr. It's not just a town, it's an industrial powerhouse.
Well, in the mid-19th century, the town is booming. The iron industry dominated everything. Everywhere you look, there were furnaces, there were forges, there were steelworks. There's a workforce which is drawn across Britain, and from Ireland. And for Irish immigrants, I should say, it was somewhat of an escape from famine. But it certainly wasn't an easy one. It wasn't an easy option. So once they made it as far as Wales, the work was hard. The housing, when it was available, was crowded, and there was an awful lot of prejudice that they had to face.
So they've moved from an environment in their own country where they are faced with prejudice and the state force, and now they have just more prejudice to deal with.
Now, in the mid-19th century in Ireland, there was a different standard of poverty in Ireland than there was in all of the rest of Great Britain. Remember that Ireland never had the same industrial base.
Right.
And then on top of that, we have the Great Famine. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. Followed by an economic depression. Now imagine in the 1850s and 60s, this shock of humanity arriving from Ireland into towns in England and Wales. The Irish immigrants settled where the rents were lowest, and they always took lower wages. You could always argue an Irish man down because they were willing to work for less.
They were desperate.
Absolutely. They were also willing to work in more dangerous conditions.
Sure.
So you find large numbers of immigrants arriving in the country. They would have put pressure on housing and employment in every district that they moved into. And this would have strained relations with local working communities. Remember too that most of these immigrants would have spoken Irish as their first language.
Yeah, of course.
So when they arrive, they live separately in Irish communities or ghettos. And the English and Welsh newspapers, they see them and they describe these people, these Irish immigrants, as destitute and ragged. You'll find regular reports of the Irish living in conditions that are overcrowded and squalid. And the papers link the Irish with crime and drunkenness and disorder. There's also the case that in the 1860s, you've got the rise of the Fenian movement. And so we see for the first time Irish immigrants in Great Britain were often portrayed in the newspapers as being dangerous and politically suspect. So with my historian's hat on, I'd say that the poor are rarely ever judged with an even hand by the establishment in any case. But for the Mackenzies, migration wouldn't have ended their insecurity. It would have actually added an extra layer of suspicion and prejudice.
So Archibald is in this environment that is scrutinizing him.
Mhm.
It's doing so in a way that he has to now adjust to, because this is a different type of scrutiny. But
Mhm.
it does help put into context a bit of the work that he is doing. So in the 1861 census, he's listed as a forge laborer. And I think it's worth maybe just going through a little bit of detail to talk about what that actually meant, right? A forge laborer. So it's really the lowest tiers of the ironworking hierarchy. He wouldn't have been a skilled individual, but would have been performing really physically demanding kind of support work that just keeps the forge operating and keeping them turning things out at speed. So
Yeah,
there's evidence that this type of work is dangerous, right?
very
They're
dangerous.
they're moving raw materials like iron and coke and limestone. He's possibly breaking limestone or cutting scrap iron. Um,
Mhm.
they're removing cinders and waste from the furnace itself. So these are heavy tasks that require endurance versus formal training, right? So there's industrial works like this that are powering the Victorian expansion and wealth, but they're really built on the back of these migrant workers in these really horrible conditions in towns like Merthyr.
Absolutely. And Archibald must have worked really long shifts. I mean, we're talking 10 or 12 hours would have been common. He would have worked the kind of conditions, the heat must have been intense. Men would have been stripped down to bare chest, and even that, of course, meant that you could be struck by flying embers, and burned. There would have been a constant noise of hammers and machinery. I don't know about you, I like to work in a quiet environment.
Yeah.
That would drive me mad.
Yeah.
So that risk of injury would have been very, very real. If you look at newspapers, Welsh newspapers, you'll actually find regular reports of men who are killed or maimed. They're burned or they're crushed in accidents in ironworks, including in Merthyr Tydfil.
You know, the more I've delved into Archibald's life, the more I realize just how lucky he really is over the course of his lifetime. He manages to pull himself through all of these really volatile experiences and environments. So all of these incoming migrants and these expanding industries, they come at a cost, right? Housing is kind of thrown up without proper drainage or ventilation.
Mhm.
Families are sharing room with lodgers.
No indoor bathrooms.
No indoor bathrooms. There is, again, outbreak of disease. So from all of these
And the
people
work
coming in,
itself would have been dirty work, grease and coal dust in the
yeah,
foundries. Just imagine that it would settle into every crevice in your skin, under your fingernails, into your hair and clothing. And Archibald's work, it would have left physical marks. So literally, the occupation, the job that he did would literally have been marked out on his person. When we look at the 1861 census, we see the Mackenzie family, and that's a family of 7, but living with them are 4 lodgers. Just imagine how packed they were.
yeah, they were really, really tight in there. So we've got the children. Jane is 18. She's working but living at home, and obviously would have, probably been a massive help to her mother. Murdoch, one of the sons, is 16, also working. So that leaves the 3 younger children, and then the lodgers. And actually, one of those lodgers ultimately marries Jane and becomes my 3rd great grandfather.
Okay, that's kind of neat. The
Yeah.
lodgers are all Irish, which is something,
Yes, and the
again, it's to
lodgers are
say,
all Irish. Yep.
yeah, that the Irish at this time could only trust and rely on the other Irish. They couldn't rely on the working people around them. So just imagine, it's a little bit like out of the frying pan into the fire. They've escaped the famine, but now they're facing prejudice and resentment of the ordinary working people around them.
So when you look on the map of the surrounding area for this period, the industrial works affect air quality. There's all sorts of things happening around them. So just very nearby, where the residents would have sat was the Vulcan Iron and Brass Foundry. It's immediately to their right on Bethesda Street. The Merthyr Brewery and a brewery pond is actually just behind the homes on Bethesda Street. But at this point in history, a brewery is an industrial force. They're operating at scale. So there would have been this continuous mechanical movement, deliveries, the manual handling of goods, steam engines moving all this grain in the
Mm.
barrels, and the wagon traffic and the cooperage work, right? They would have done on the barrels themselves. gases from the fermentation process, all of these elements would have added to the local environment. It's just an attack on the senses.
Absolutely. And if you look at the census, you see you're in the middle of a commercial district. You've got the foundry, you've got the brewery, which I hadn't seen. You've got shops like a grocer's or a cordwainer's, a shoebinder, a tailor's. So people are packed tight in this commercial district.
So for genealogists, there's the kind of that story behind the census record here that we see on Find My Past. It's not just where someone lived, it's how they lived and who they leaned on.
Bethesda Street, Merthyr Tydfil. It's late on a Sunday morning in 1860, and the Hibernian beer house hums with voices and tankards clinking against scarred wood. A place where hearty laughter and stories from home offer refuge from the clang and grind of the ironworks. Archibald MacKenzie leans against the bar, shoulders hunched, the weight of years etched into his face. Around him, men talk fast, Irish accents rising and falling like waves. Then the door bursts open. 2 constables step inside to investigate the hubbub, boots heavy on the boards. Silence ripples through the room. "What do you want here?" Archibald's voice cuts the hush, hard and low. A scuffle breaks like a storm, fists, shouts, the crash of a chair. A saucepan swings, iron scrapes against wood. Someone cries out as a blow lands. By the time the dust settles, the charge sheets will tell the story. Violent assault on the police. 6 months hard labour. Another line in the record, but behind it, a world of tension, where identity and authority collide.
Okay, Fiona, we've just stepped inside the Hibernian beer house, where a Sunday scuffle turns into something a lot more serious. And we need to move now into additional sources to help tell this part of the story as well. So we've talked about newspapers a lot in this series. We're going to continue to use historical newspapers on Find My Past, but we can also use court records, of course. That allows us to really dig into this moment in Archibald's life. And it turns out this is not insignificant. This is a violent assault on the police, and he ends up getting 6 months hard labor. But before we go any further, I want to pause on the name because it's really significant, I think.
Yeah.
And it is the Hibernian beer house. It comes from Hibernia, classical Latin name for Ireland. So
The land of winter?
Right, exactly. So when you see the beer house named Hibernian outside of Ireland, this is a very clear signal. This is an Irish space. This is an Irish community. This is a gathering point for Irishmen.
Absolutely. The Hibernian would have been obviously, I mean, at first glance, any Irish person would tell you that's an Irish space. These places were more than pubs. For Irish workers in Merthyr Tydfil, the Hibernian beer house, you got me at it now, offered familiarity and community in a town which was dominated by iron and by coal. But that visibility also drew attention from the authorities.
So just to give this some context, we went to Peugeot's directory, a very common source, right? City directory. In 1835, they list over 50 pubs and retailers of beer in Merthyr Tydfil. Bethesda Street was also home to the Shamrock pub at one point, although that occurs later after Archibald's already moved on. By 1848, there are 12 breweries producing in Merthyr, and by 1861, there's nearly 30,000 people living in Wales that are Irish, and primarily in these large industrial towns like Merthyr. So there's a whole culture and community, of course, and as you say, this is more than just a pub, right?
These pubs would have been a meeting place for these Irish immigrants, and women would have gone into them as well, and that would have scandalised the Welsh and the English, the idea of a woman in a pub. But pubs were not just places to eat or to drink, they also functioned as job exchanges. It's a place where you could pick up work. They were a kind of a community hub. It was a place where you'd hear the Irish language and maybe Irish dialects, even for people who spoke English, and where you'd find news from home. But here's the thing, we begin to see growing tensions between these Irish pubs in Wales and the communities that they move into.
There is a
Mhm.
lot of anti-Irish commentary in 19th century press.
Absolutely. And it's commentary which is laced with terms which aren't unfamiliar to us now when we hear people talking about the immigration debate. They're talking about housing. They're talking about employment. They're talking about, well, in the terms of the day, poor relief. Now we'd call it welfare, I suppose. But all of these things, they sharpen resentment. And in this kind of climate, the Irish immigrants were a very convenient blame sink for
Sure.
wider social problems. Because Irish immigrants quite literally were other. They spoke a different language. They were mainly Catholic in a country in Wales where the population was predominantly Protestant, Episcopalian and Methodist and Baptist. They looked different. They probably also had different social habits and different ways of socializing. And that would have marked them out as being different and separate.
Yeah, definitely. So you've got a population of Irish migrants. They're viewed with suspicion. The newspapers are actually just kind of like exploding this, intensifying this tension. So I'd imagine that any encounter with authority could escalate pretty quickly. So for Archibald, to bring it back to kind of our main character here, this constant tension with authority almost naturally leads to this fight that he's involved in his second arrest. It's almost like it was fated to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the police go into that pub and they're looking for trouble.
So he's actually charged with assaulting a constable in discharge of his duty. Very official sounding. He's charged alongside two other men, Michael and Daniel Kelly. He's ultimately sentenced to 6 months.
The newspapers even describe that he was roughly treated.
That line in the article is really striking, right? That he is roughly, we do not say undeservedly, treated by the police. It's remarkable to read that. As his descendant, obviously, that it just makes you kind of stand up on edge a little bit. It just speaks volumes about the bias that is being demonstrated.
Yeah, and Archibald would have had no comeback. The police had impunity. But if you look at the newspapers, we see common phrases recurring again and again. Phrases like disorderly, and that carries a certain kind of moral judgment. Or riotous, and that suggests criminal behaviour. Or turbulent, that suggests turbulent seas. So you're talking about chaos and something which is unstable. Improvident is another one, and idle habits. And all of these, what these things specifically say is these are people who don't plan ahead. These are moral failings. And the Irish are continuously engaged in improper conduct. It's not always defined, but it's a little bit like saying that something is inappropriate today. It actually captures a multitude.
You have to really understand this is where context plays a huge part in telling this story. So this is a single incident with a newspaper report, with a court document. It could look like a moral failing. But when you pair it with that social history and those overcrowded streets and the ethnic prejudice and the pressure of industrial life, this is, again, and you said it at the beginning, this is just a fragment of a much larger story. So it's a real opportunity for us to state really clearly and to understand newspapers of this period and all the way to today are biased, right? You cannot read a newspaper article and just go, that is actual fact. It's exactly how that happened. The witnesses in this case are stating exactly what went down. This is not neutral reporting.
That's very true. There is bias in newspapers, but they often carry colour that you won't find in the official state records. They're not neutral in any shape or form, but they capture a greater part of the population and the ordinary everyday people than you'll often find in state sources.
So this family is kind of, surrounded once again by all of the prejudice and the tension. There's a social stigma around Archibald being in jail. There's a known a report of, disproportionate number really of Irish committing petty crimes. The phrase thieving like an Irishman was quite popular across parts of rural Wales during this period. So the entire community would have likely felt some anxiety over this event, right? This isn't just Archibald being involved in a bar fight. This is a much larger picture. There's three men that are actually convicted. This is kind of that waiting for the other foot to drop moment. It's like they're waiting for the police to come back and finish the job.
Yeah, I mean, this is the police. They've intruded on what would have been a communal Irish space, but a space where they would have expected to be able to meet and
Be safe a little
be
bit.
safe, exactly,
Yeah.
and to see their own community. But the police have intruded onto that. I suppose trying to show that they needed to be careful about what it was that they did. So to some extent, I think what we're seeing is Archibald and these other two being made an example of. Don't step out of line.
All of this must feed into the next decision that the Mackenzies have to make.
I think so. I think it's very probable that for the Mackenzies, they realise that at this stage, Europe is a dead letter for them. They really need to move on. Try and find a place where they're not going to be faced with the same level of resentment and prejudice, where they can have good relations with their neighbours, where they can develop those kind of bonds of trust, not just with one or two people who come from the same ethnic group, but from everybody in their community.
It's winter 1861 in Merthyr Tydfil. The ironworks roar on the horizon, but inside a narrow house on Bethesda Street, the world feels still. A fire glows low in the grate, its light flickering across soot-stained walls. Eliza bends over a cradle to pacify a hungry baby, while two boys hunch at the table, scratching letters into worn copybooks. Archibald sits by the window, covered in coal dust, hands raw from the forge. He watches the fire, its glow softening the hard lines of his face, and ponders what comes next. Outside, the street is alive, voices calling, wheels clattering over stone. But here, in this cramped room, there is a fragile sense of continuity. He has served another sentence, and, once more, has a choice to make. For Archibald, survival has never been simple. It is work and worry, risk and resilience. And in this quiet moment, surrounded by family, with the clang of the furnace drifting through the night, endurance feels like an inheritance, something to pass on, even when the world outside is iron and smoke.
Throughout this series and the imagery that we've just walked through with Archibald kind of contemplating his experience, we've been framing all of this as survival, but maybe that's not the only thing happening here. I think there's endurance that is reflected in this story as well. And, of course, as I've said, it's very personal for me, right? If he hadn't made the decisions that he did, I wouldn't be who I am today. My family wouldn't be the same. The generational lessons would be different. I'm not even sure that I would have been raised Catholic without Archibald's and Eliza's influence. So there's a lot that goes into this beyond just survival.
Yeah, absolutely. Migration wasn't just a physical journey, it was a cultural and an emotional one. And families like Archibald's, they carried with them traditions and names and memories into new landscapes. That continuity is important. And that's why we still see Irish identity woven through Welsh communities today and in Irish America.
So here we have Archibald on the cusp of yet another big decision for his family, and one that actually brings the family to the United States, following, that well-known path for so many Irish men and women.
Mhm.
And we know they did that just after having spent just a few years in Wales. They moved to America. Passenger lists and the U.S. Census records reveal that they did this in small increments. Today would refer to this as chain migration, where the family kind of comes over in stages as they could afford the passage. So the first one over actually is Murdoch and the boarder, who eventually becomes my third great-grandfather. They travel together. And then Archibald is brought over himself, and then Eliza follows with Jane and the other children. So it's three main pieces of immigration. They settle originally in Pennsylvania and then actually moved down to Alabama.
Hmm.
The family ultimately helps build a brand new Catholic parish in their adopted city, and the Mackenzies are remembered and memorialized at that church as being one of the founding members. And actually, generations of their descendants would celebrate their life events in that church. My own parents got married there in that parish.
That's kind of
Uh,
neat.
yeah, I love that actually. And my mom used to talk about that church. It's the church she was raised in, Blessed Sacrament in Birmingham, Alabama. And to know that Archibald and his family had such an impact on this place that was so very special to my mother. Um, it, these journeys are so much more than immigration.
And I think those patterns resonate even down to the present day.
Yeah.
When we talk about migration, whether it's driven by conflict or climate or just economic migration, the themes that we've explored in the last few sessions, they're strikingly familiar. People leaving home, often the push and the pull, the reasons for leaving, and the yearning to remain at home. But then settling into a new community, having to adapt to a different place, or having to adapt to a different continent, holding on to your identity while you're trying to create something new.
And it's remarkable to me that this migration happens in the way that it does, but it also happens in the midst of the U.S. Civil War, which is a whole nother conflict that they are knowingly walking into. So for genealogists, I think that's a bit of a gift of these documents. They don't just confirm where someone lived. They open that window into something much more. So behind every census line, every court entry, there's a story of choices that are made under pressure. And it's those choices that carry forward, that really
Mhm.
shape who we are today.
But isn't it interesting as well that although there's a small number of documents, even when we widen that out by using newspapers, there's still an awful lot that you can tease out and that you can actually uncover much more concrete detail about what was actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, it's an incredible way to demonstrate that even a small amount of information can give us a much bigger, broader understanding, right? And
Mhm.
we hear it so often, especially with Irish genealogy. Irish research is so hard. There's no records left. There was a lot of record destruction, but the scraps that we've been given, we've been able to explore an entire family.
And a case study which actually tells us something which is, although it's unique to your family, it's also something which is a very general experience of Irish emigration or immigration from your perspective.
So when we trace some of these threads, we can go back to this idea of endurance, right? It's lived, it's
Hmm.
recorded, it's often passed on. And we connect that not just with history, but with human capacity.
Absolutely. And that ability to adapt and survive and thrive in different worlds, different communities, and uncertain times.
Archibald's story began in the quiet lanes of Kildare, wound through riot and famine in Cork, and carried him into the busy industry of Merthyr Tydfil. We've traced those steps in Find My Past records, parish registers, court entries, census lines, newspapers. Each one a fragment of a life lived under pressure. It's the story of a man who lost his footing a little in Ireland, transitioned and found work in Wales, and then later crosses the Atlantic to start again, a journey that ultimately connects him to me. He endures hardship and sees his community and his life change before his eyes. He left behind a legacy that I'm fortunate to be able to explore today. If you've just joined us, you can catch up on parts 1 and 2 of A Family History of the Irish Famine wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd ask you to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to leave us a review if you've enjoyed what you've heard, and follow us on social media at A Family History of for more. If you'd like to delve deeper into Archibald's story, head over to findmypast.co.uk/A Family History of, where we've curated a collection of the records and newspaper articles featured across the last 3 episodes. Thanks for listening, and join us again next time on A Family History of.